There's a very interesting anniversary taking place out on Australian roads right about now. It's roughly the 10th birthday of the first deployment of the dreaded DPF, the mighty diesel particulate filter, out on the roads. Imagine that, all those utes, all those diesel SUVs with that ticking time bomb up their clacker. Generation one of anything, always so impossibly hilarious at about this age, isn't it? You know, so rather than talk about this in the abstract, I have the horrible case of an dude here who has just paid $8,500 for a, let's be frank, imperfect solution to just such a drama with his nearly 10-year-old Navara ute. So I want to cover this off so that if you are faced with that dreaded warning light on your dashboard, you know what to expect and you know how to communicate with the mechanic, because there's no guarantees that he's not going to be a Keystone Cops participant in a comedy of errors. So to the extent that the world's not perfect, here's how to get this right. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars cheap, but Australia only. Website. Card. If you've got a 10-year-old diesel ute or SUV in your driveway, it probably tells me that maybe you're not on the poverty line, but you might be doing it a bit tough. The financial pressure of just living might be really on you at the moment with various other economic factors in play, rising cost of living, rising cost of mortgages and rents and things of that nature, okay? So the prospect of an $8,000 to $10,000 repair bill is like, you don't need it. It's going to put a hole in everything. It's going to put a hole in the rent or the mortgage or discretionary spending on the kids or maybe even Christmas. So I want to use an example here. I want to use this example from an dude just like you to mitigate this $8,000 to $10,000 problem to the extent that it can be mitigated. Now, this is from a dude. I'm not going to name him. I'm just going to call him Obi. Obi. Not Obi-Wan, which would be the ultimate Jedi name. More of an Australian Jedi name. I'm going to call him Obi Steve. Obi Steve, he writes in complete sentences. It's amazing. And he punctuates. And there's paragraphs. Like it's sentences, punctuation, commas and full stops used appropriately, spaces in between the paragraphs. Like FMD, dude. And yet, he's a freelance carpenter. One question is like light bulb moment. One question. What went wrong, Obi Steve? With brains like this, you could have been a boiler maker or a welder fabricator or a fitter machinist, perhaps even a tool maker. And yet here you are working on wood. Like wood. It doesn't deserve respect, wood. Like you look at it the wrong way, you look at wood the wrong way and it just falls apart, doesn't it? You can never get the welding settings right. Even in a small shop like this, though, you have to get your Jedi on, usually the dark side, obviously, but even that press there, you use the power of your mind and a small hydraulic ram to harness the raw, inexorable power of 200 strippers. Imagine that, concentrate the power of 200 strippers onto one point and form metal into precise shapes with your mind. Just saying. Obi Steve goes, I'm reaching out for... He doesn't speak like this, clearly, because he's educated, right? But I like reading your emails in sort of household voices. It's just good for entertainment. I'm reaching out for some advice on a situation I'm currently facing with my 2015 Nissan Navara MP300, so almost 10 years old, which has done close to 139,000 kilometres. So what's that about? 15,000 k's a year? You don't drive much, dude. Come on. Not for a tradie. Anyway, at the end of June, I started to sound educated then. The DPF light came on, so I took it in for a service as it was nearly due, and I asked them to address a DPF issue. The mechanic charged $1,500 for removal and inspection, and another $900 for cleaning. I found the cost to be excessive. Yeah, no, this is $2,400, right? $2,400 to remove part of the exhaust system and clean it. Like, come on. This got to be the authorised dealer, right? A private mechanic couldn't look you in the face and think that was reasonable. Anyway, but I trusted their recommendation when they advised against removing the DPF altogether, which was something I initially suggested to avoid future issues. Okay, there's a big red flag coming up for me here, and that is that, we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, this is something that hardly anyone gets about DPFs. Now, because this is technically unsponsored, this video, I'm going to sponsor it myself. Now, I'm going to do this in under 60 seconds. No need to skip ahead. Get some of this stuff. This is Sonax SX90 Plus. It's awesome. I've got all these projects here. They're all rusting away because they're in various stages. This is great for corrosion protection and lubrication. It hasn't completely replaced WD-40 for me because I love the solvent in WD-40. If you've got a sticker or something, you've got to remove it. Like, if it's on a tool and you just, particularly a scraper or a saw, then the solvent in WD-40 is really good for that. But if you want actual lubrication performance and long-lasting corrosion protection, this SX90 stuff is awesome. It's from Sonax. It's a German company, but it's an Australian family import operation. So if you buy this stuff, you're actually supporting a good Aussie small business as well. I'll put all the details in the description, and there's a discount code as well. So there's that. And the other thing is batteries and solar, okay? Huge fan of home solar, particularly with a battery. It's quite a sunny day today, and it's like 3 o'clock. I just had a look at the app. My battery is at 100%. That means the sun's going to, in 3 hours' time, it's going to be gone. The panels are going to be doing nothing, and I'm going to be going into the night, and the whole house is going to be powered all night with electricity that I harvested during the day. And these batteries are safe. They're not subjected to the same kinds of harsh operating environments as cars and scooters and things of that nature. They're just a really good addition. So if you go to autoexpert.com.au/solar and fill in the form there, I can set you up with a really good company that can provide you with a modular battery solution. Batteries in 3.2 kilowatt hour modules. You can add as many as you need, up to about 6. I've currently got 4 for about 13, and that runs the whole house overnight. So beautiful. autoexpert.com.au/solar for more on that. Now, back to Obi, okay? Obi is all about removing the DPF and future issues and all of this stuff. And he goes, a few days later, the ute lost power again. This is after they cleaned it, right? As though the DPF was blocked, the mechanic then told me I needed new injectors and said he'd send me a quote. Well, how convenient, okay? Here's the thing that nobody gets with DPFs when they fail. It's a symptom. The DPF warning light and the blockage of the DPF is a symptom of another problem, okay? If you fix the DPF, you haven't fixed the problem, it's just going to happen again. This is like every time. Count on it, dude, because the DPF clogs up when something else goes wrong with the engine. For example, if you've got a turbocharged engine, which all diesels are, all diesels with DPFs are turbocharged, right? So when you get to the turbo, the inlet air comes in, goes through the turbo, gets pressurized, and goes into the engine. And it goes from the turbo to the engine via a hose or a series of hoses. And they're rubber hoses, they perish over time. If there's a tiny little defect in that hose and it loses a bit of pressure, then the mass airflow sensor, the so-called MAF sensor, reads a particular amount of air coming into the car, and it's the wrong amount of air because some of it's being lost after it was pressurized. It's leaking back out. That means the fuel's going to be wrong. It's going to overfuel, and that means you're going to be driving along overfueling continuously. It's going to kill the DPF. It's going to block it, okay? If you unblock the DPF, you replace the DPF, whatever, you haven't fixed the problem. It's just going to happen again in days to weeks, okay? And this is just like Groundhog Day. It's hell on earth because you're back to the dealership or you're back to the mechanic and it's having the same conversation, and they say, we can change it again, you know. This is just, It's unacceptable. So whenever the DPF light comes on your car, the best piece of advice I can give you is that it's a symptom. It's like having a brain tumour. You've got a headache. If you cure the symptom, which is the headache, with Panadol, you haven't fixed the problem. It's like it's pissing down with rain, let's say. Your basement fills up with water. The water in the basement is a symptom, but the problem is something with the drainage, right? If you don't fix the problem, it doesn't matter how many buckets of water you take out, it's still going to happen again next time it pisses down with rain. So this is that, okay? Fixing the DPF does not fix the problem. You might have to replace the DPF because it might be rooted, but you're going to have to fix the problem. And that means up front, you have to identify the other problem. So it sounds to me like these screwed injectors are the real problem here, and something to do with a defect in these injectors has flowed down through the system and killed the DPF, right? So Obi goes on. After waiting a week without a quote, I contacted him, the mechanic, and he mentioned that he'd been trying to source reasonably priced injectors. They were quite expensive in WA. He eventually quoted $3,500 for parts from the eastern states. I agreed to proceed, and he said he would book it in as soon as the injectors arrived, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, there's a bit of a wait, and they do the job. It takes longer than anticipated. I dropped the ute off, expecting it to be ready the same day, as the quote included 5 hours of labour. However, when I called the following day, he said it wouldn't be ready till the end of the week because I had to send the exhaust off for further work. Frustrating, but I accepted it, hoping the issue would finally be resolved. A couple of days later, he called again, informed me that the DPF needed to be replaced at a cost of $2,500. Yeah, because the problem just kept happening again, right? I was shocked. I get it, dude. $2,500, 2.5 here, 3.5 there. Like, why do you think the... Sorry, getting over a cold. Why do you think the defibrillator's always in the service department? Like, it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? $2,500 here, 3.5 here, 2.5 to clean and inspect it the first time. Like, Jesus. As I'd already paid for it to be clean, he suggested the damage occurred because I'd driven the vehicle, it wasn't functioning properly. Yeah, probably. I argued this was due to the extended delays in getting the repairs done, to which he responded that sourcing the parts had been difficult. I think that's a fairly honest exchange, actually, but it's like, these are the logistics. Frustrated but needing the ute back, I told him to proceed. The next day he called again to say the replacement DPF didn't fit, and now suggested removing the DPF entirely, ironically the same solution I had proposed 3 months earlier. Okay, so we'll get to the 3 main questions Obi asks me about all of this, right? But the point here is that even if you remove the DPF, which I really don't think you should do, but even if you do, it doesn't change the fact that the injectors were stuffed. And that was the problem. Hopefully that was the problem. Hopefully it's not something else as well, right? Because how would we know? And it is very difficult for mechanics to drill down into the complexity of modern engines and come up with a definitive problem solution sort of framework. That's increasingly difficult, much harder than it was in the 80s or 90s, right? The increasing complexity of cars has made them more reliable, but when they are problematic, the diagnosis is much more difficult today. Okay, it's people have the wrong idea about fault codes and plugging in. Dealerships get it wrong all the time too. There simply isn't a sensor for everything that can go wrong with a car. So you can plug in all you want and get all the fault codes. It doesn't tell you what's wrong. It gives you some hints about where the problem might be, perhaps. But when the DPF fails, you've got to look at everything in the inlet air and the fuel delivery system, because that's what's causing it, guaranteed, okay? So Obi Steve goes, this brings me to my main concerns. Number 1, do you believe I've been overcharged or misled in this process? If so, is there a body I can approach to lodge a formal complaint? No, I don't think you've been overcharged, but I think knowing what we know now, so to speak, you could have gone into this and said, I want the DPF replaced, but I want the cause of the problem identified, right? And guaranteed this would have saved you $2,500. Now, I don't think you should pay for a DPF that a mechanic orders for you, but which does, quote unquote, does not fit, okay? So if you've paid for that, that's on the mechanic. They need to send it back. If it doesn't fit your vehicle and they haven't fitted it to your vehicle, then you need to not be paying for that, okay? So I don't think you've been overcharged necessarily, subject to those things. I don't think you've been misled, because I think your mechanic, I don't know if it's a dealership or not, but I think the mechanic is on a voyage of discovery here, and this might be the first time they've looked at something like this. And it just tells me that the problem is that they don't know the difference between a symptom, DPF death, and a problem, what caused it. Okay, and this is really important to know. It's never just the DPF. The DPF is a symptom. The DPF is the headache. You've got to find the brain tumour, right? That's the mechanic's job. And it is a highly skilled job these days to know that. It's hard to do. Number 2 from Obi Steve. Is it legal to remove the DPF? No, it's not. If so, why wouldn't this be recommended to all diesel ute owners to avoid future costs? Now, there's the technicality of legality and illegality, and I'm no lawyer, but my understanding is that cars need to remain ADR compliant throughout their life. And if you remove the DPF, the car is no longer ADR compliant. I don't know that there would be too many highway patrol officers who would pull over an otherwise conservative middle-aged tradies ute and look under the bonnet and note the absence of a DPF and fine you, okay? But if there is some blitz and the EPA gets involved, then I do know that here in New South Wales, the fine is like 5 figures for that. You know, it's a hefty fine if you get caught for doing something like that. The risk is low, but the fine is big. And if you did get pinged for that, my strong advice, not being a lawyer, but my strong advice would be to take it to court, right? Because even if there's no mitigation, it's your democratic right to have something taken to court, right? And if you plead guilty at the first available opportunity, in New South Wales at least, that entitles you to a significant discount in the penalty. I've seen this happen over and over and over again where there was no mitigation. People had a driving record as long as your frickin' arm, and all they do is go to court and plead guilty, and a $2,500 fine becomes $500. Okay, so yes, it's illegal. The risk of getting pinged is low. If you do get pinged, there's a mechanism through which you can reduce the penalty. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. Let's not forget, though, that DPFs were implemented for human health because the particles are bad for you, and if everyone took off their DPFs, air quality would be worse. So there's that. Steve-O goes on and says, Obi Steve, says, am I being unreasonable in expecting more from the mechanic, or is this level of service what should be expected? I don't think you're being unreasonable, but I think old school mechanics in particular need to evolve, right? Because in the olden days, when I was a kid, it was pretty easy to diagnose problems with cars. It was just air and fuel and spark, right? And if you had those 3 things, then car was going to run. And if it broke down under load at high RPM, you'd say, oh, that's a fuel problem, or maybe it's spark plugs or something like that. If it broke down in the wet, you'd link that to what was happening, and not that hard. But these days, there's so many different sensors and systems that operate feedback loops to control engines that diagnosis of a problem can be quite complex. And the upskilling of mechanics so that efficient solutions can be deployed to vehicles in this sort of age bracket, that's a real challenge for the aftermarket industry in particular. But dealerships don't want to know either, right? Dealerships just want to change the oil and bleed the brakes or something on relatively new cars. I mean, they hate the thought of any competition, but they really don't want to work on the aging vehicles in the fleet. Like, they just don't. So there needs to be, I guess, a group of younger mechanics are coming through, and they're sort of half hackers and half spanner spinners, right? And that's a good thing, because your old school mechanic. Like, I know the guy who's serviced my cars independently for years. He's a few years younger than me. He's in his mid-50s kind of thing. He had to give it away because it was driving him insane, dealing with more modern computerized feedback loop type problems in cars, right? And he just works on the classic stuff now, and he's friggin' happy as Larry doing it, half his luck. He just doesn't want to do that. So Obi Steve concludes and says, I'm hoping to finally get my ute back tomorrow. Now, without the DPF, I paid $2,500 to clean and $2,500 to remove. $2,500 to remove. And with the new fuel injectors costing $3,500, altogether I spent about $8,500 on these repairs, not including the approximately 3 weeks I've been unable to work as a self-employed carpenter. In hindsight, I feel I should have been a tool maker or a fitter. He didn't say that. In hindsight, I feel it may have been more cost effective to invest in a new vehicle. I really appreciate your thoughts and any guidance you could provide. I don't think there's a higher authority you can appeal to, Obi Steve, unfortunately. I don't think you've been quote unquote ripped off, but I don't think this is the most cost effective solution for you. Had you gone in at the outset with, my DPF needs replacing, it's 10 years old, it's rooted, but I need you to identify the cause of its rootedness before I will tick the box to you doing any work on the car, then that would have been the way to approach that. And frankly, I believe that your mechanic should have guided you through this process, right? He should have jumped you through these hoops. And I can only assume that he's not all that familiar with it. But anytime that DPF warning light comes on, I'd be looking for an aftermarket replacement DPF as part of the solution. Because the DPF, unless it's a very new car and the problem is very minor and you get it early kind of thing, the DPF's going to be screwed. Okay, so you just need to replace it. You don't have to go genuine. You can put an aftermarket DPF in. That's no problem. But you need to find that other cause. And it all needs to be part of the one assignment. Otherwise, brand new DPF is going to be driving around just waiting for the basement to flood again, waiting for the Panadol to wear off and the migraine from hell to come back, because you haven't tackled the cause, haven't tackled the problem. You fix the symptom but not the disease, and this is the problem with DPFs generally, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse now because we're starting to see this first tranche of 10-year-old DPF vehicles in the market. And there's just going to be more and more and more of them. And as vehicles get older, there'll be defects in the inlet air plumbing and defects with injectors and defects with the architecture of the regeneration of the filters themselves, because that can fail. There's a pressure transducer, like a differential pressure transducer at the inlet and outlet of the DPF. And that tells the regeneration system to start turning it into a furnace and burn those particles off when the pressure when the pressure differential gets to a certain level, which indicates a load of particles that are being trapped in there, right? If that pressure transducer fails in some way or gets occluded or just doesn't function properly, then the regeneration won't happen. And you can replace the DPF, but the pressure transducer system will still be defective and the same problem will recur. So it really is a matter of finding some specialist and also telling them that you're interested in a cost-effective solution. If you choose to remove the DPF, then that's kind of on you. Technically it's illegal and you are at risk of getting fined for that, but I guess that's one way to do it. I'd be looking for a reasonably high quality but cheaper than genuine aftermarket replacement system, but I wouldn't entertain fitting it to the vehicle until the root cause of the problem had been identified. That's all I got for you on this. If that warning light goes on, I sincerely hope it's not weeks before Christmas for you, and I hope you manage to get a solution out of this that is at least a little more cost effective than for Obi Steve. I hope it doesn't happen to you at all, but that's what you do if it does.